Can you believe it's been 90 years since the Jaeger LeCoultre Reverso was first introduced? Feels like only a decade shy of a century ago. Of course, not being at least 90 myself, the genesis of perhaps Jaeger LeCoultre's most famous watch is not a memory I share, but nevertheless it turned out to be a pretty big moment for the watchmaker's watchmaker. Here are 5 bonkers facts about the Reverso to celebrate. Looking to buy, sell, or exchange a premium watch? Visit Watchfinder, the pre-owned watch specialist. A big thank you to every single person who watches and enjoys these videos. It really means a huge amount to us, and to me personally. Your subscription would be hugely appreciated. It helps more than you can know. Thank you. It's a well-told tale how businessman Cesar Detrey was challenged to find a watch suitable for the rigors of the game polo. But what's less well known is how the watch actually came into existence. We imagine he entrusted the work entirely to his good friend Jaeger LeCoultre, but that's not actually what happened. LeCoultre was predominantly a manufacturer of movements, not watches, and so Jaeger was only tasked with designing the Reverso's movement. The reversible case that gives the iconic watch its legendary name was commissioned by Detrey to engineer Alfred Chauveau, and before Chauveau's patent had even been granted, Detrey had purchased the rights. That's because, being a savvy businessman, he had something of a hunch that stood to earn him a lot of money. The 1930s had just begun, and the wristwatch was very uncommon. Luxury watchmaking was all about bespoke-made pocket watches built to a customer's unique requirements. A luxury wristwatch wasn't really a thing, never mind a mass-produced off-the-shelf one. Detrey saw the Reverso as the next big thing, the watch that turned wristwatches from being something ladies wore to a desirable luxury purchase for men. Jaeger LeCoultre already had some experience making ladies' wristwatches for Cartier, plus a few unique pieces, and so the company was at least capable of building Detrey's vision. But this was the first proper luxury wristwatch series Jaeger LeCoultre, then just LeCoultre, had ever branded as its own. The launch in 1931 was a new chapter for Jaeger LeCoultre, to no longer be just the watchmaker's watchmaker, but to become a watchmaker in its own right. It seems crazy and yet somehow obvious to say, but the Reverso is a sports watch. It seems crazy because this slender, polished, delicate piece of Art Deco design looks better suited as a royal gift, which it has been many times, than a tough bruiser. But it's obvious because that was the very origins of its creation. The challenge was to build a watch capable of withstanding the rigors of an impact sport. Mallets, balls, horses, other players, the ground. There's plenty going on to destroy a gentleman's watch, which is why the request came in the first place. Quite specifically, Detrey's challenge was issued in India. The player who issued it, a high-ranking military official. The military was about the only place you'd see a wristwatch on a man in that period, and it was safe to say the offerings, many based on ladies' wristwatches, were not adapted to survive a game of polo. So that makes the Reverso a sports watch. But if anything more convincing was needed than that, it was also one of the first watches to offer not just a high-contrast black dial, very unusual for the time, but also luminous markers. This was the realm of military tool, not luxury timekeeper, making the Reverso not only Jaeger LeCoultre's first proper watch, but also one of the first sports watches ever. It was a tumultuous time for the watch industry, the 1930s, because whilst a few bright minds knew the wristwatch was on its way in, there were many manufacturers getting anxious about how the pocket watch was on its way out. Post-war and into the Great Depression, it was a shaky time for the kind of customer luxury brands such as Patek Philippe were invested in, and they needed a solution fast. As it so happens, Jacques-David LeCoultre was an administrator on the board of Patek Philippe at the time, and he and Detrey, keen to hedge their bets on this new Reverso, offered it to Patek Philippe as well. The idea was well received, and 8 pieces were made for Patek Philippe. These reference 106 were some of the first Reversos ever made, in fact. A year later, Patek Philippe launched the Calatrava, its own interpretation of the modern luxury wristwatch, and so the joint Reverso project was no longer required. But that's not the only slice of bad luck Jacques-David LeCoultre experienced with Patek Philippe. That esteemed watchmaker was offered for sale to Jacques-David, an offer that in hindsight probably shouldn't have been refused. Instead, the company was sold to the Stern family, who still own it to this day. Okay, so this is where things start getting really wacky. Detrey knew time was short when it came to the release of the Reverso, that speed was very much of the essence. Getting to market first could be make or break not just for the watch, but the entire future of Jaeger LeCoultre's watchmaking business, if it were indeed to have one. It was crunch time. Christmas 1931 was the deadline. Other watchmakers were hot on their tails. Chauveau's case design was complete by March of that same year. All that was needed was for Jaeger LeCoultre to build it and to develop a movement to place inside it. Unlike that Patek Philippe reference 106 Reverso, which had a tiny round ladies' watch caliber from Jaeger LeCoultre inside, Jaeger LeCoultre itself wanted to furnish its own iteration with a movement more befitting its reputation. The rectangular case needed a big rectangular movement, even if it wasn't to be seen. The Caliber 410 was the answer, built to the brand's exacting standards and filling the case up as a good movement should. But there was a problem. The Caliber 410 wasn't ready until 1933, 2 years after the Reverso's launch. That meant, to meet the deadline, the first few years of Reverso production did not feature a movement from Jacques-David LeCoultre himself. A Tavan Caliber 063 was chosen instead, forever remaining an irony in the history of the watchmaker's watchmaker. The 1931 launch of the Reverso was an enormous success. The watch was heralded as a design masterpiece of its time, and quickly became not only a sporting icon, but a canvas as well. The reversible case lent itself, quite by accident, to being the perfect medium upon which to engrave, paint and generally embellish, making the Reverso the gift of choice for esteemed members of society. From enamelled portraits of the Maharaja's wife, to a talisman bearing a coat of arms, the Reverso has become home to hundreds of individual customizations offered by the watchmaker. But this feverish interest wasn't to last. The distinct styling of the Reverso made it just as unpopular as fashion evolved as it had been popular when it was of its moment, and it all but disappeared from Jaeger LeCoultre's memory. That is, until 1972. The market was shifting again, but in a way never seen before. Quartz technology was threatening to eradicate the mechanical master entirely, if not for one saving grace: style. Italian distributor Giorgio Corvo had a plan to revive the Reverso's iconic looks and make it popular once again. But there was a problem. Jaeger LeCoultre had forgotten how to make them. There were 200 spare cases left, and that was it. Chauveau's incredibly complex patent, filed in March 1931, without context, was incomprehensible. But no matter, the brand cased up its remaining stock and never expected to hear from Corvo about it again. But they did, because he sold them all in a month. And not just to any old Joe, but to the likes of Gucci and Versace. It was panic stations at Jaeger LeCoultre, and I'm sure they later saw the funny side, Reverse engineer the Reverso. The man in charge of that unenviable task was one Daniel Wild, who succeeded not only in bringing the watch back to life, but also improving its reliability and ruggedness, albeit at the expense of using 55 parts instead of the original's 23. So with that, it's happy birthday to the Reverso, the big 9-0. In another 10 years it'll be a century, and that's when you get a card from the monarch. Perhaps if the Queen's still with us, a lady rather fond of Jaeger LeCoultre, it must be said, she'll gift a little message on the back of the most appropriate medium I can think of, a Jaeger LeCoultre Reverso. Discover more exceptional watches at Watchfinder. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please do consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If there are any watches you'd like to see featured, please let us know in the comments below.